thank you so much for coming. Glad you're here. We have a lot to cover today, and so let's get rolling. I want to start off with what an assessment means. Assessment comes from the Latin to sit with. The goal of an evaluation is to sit with a child, to really understand and be present with them where they are in that area. So it's not something we do to a child, it's something we do with a child. You can see from this cartoon, there's a dog with a chain on his neck at the end of the porch looking at this cat, and it says, "Let me preface my remarks by saying that the chain is a lot longer than it looks." And this is a topic for me where it's easy for me to hop off the porch and go chase something because I think there are a lot of important things that we'd like to cover, but I'm going to do my best to sit on the porch, stay in the core areas I want to, and not take a leap off and chase something down that, while I think is important, gets us off track. So depending on your questions at the end, I may jump off the porch. 5 areas I want to cover. Models of reading, key areas to measure, know your test, interpreting the scores, and how do we recognize dyslexia. That's what we're going to cover today. When you think about reading, what is the model that should come to mind? What's the guidance on reading? There are a few key pillars that should guide our thinking. Anyone want to take a jump at it? Okay, there's one part. What else? Yep, keep going. Vocabulary, keep going. Comprehension. So those are the findings of the National Reading Panel. This is the Holy Grail. This is the blueprint for reading. So when we think about reading, whether that's an assessment or instruction, curriculum purchases, this needs to be in your mind. This is the science of reading. This is what we know to be true. So this is what I want you to have in your mind as a starting point as we talk about evaluation. I also want to build this model out a little further. I want you to separate out the first 3. Okay, let me also say that in this model with the 5 pillars, each one is necessary, but in itself insufficient. If you only have one pillar, that roof's not going to hold. So each one is necessary, but in and of itself insufficient. They all work together. But I want you to separate in your mind the first 3 from the second 2. The first 3 have to do with phonemic awareness, phonics fluency. Those are mechanical parts of reading. So being aware of the sounds, mapping those sounds to letters, and being able to read words across a page fluently. And those are separate from the oral language components of what? That's right, vocabulary and comprehension. So I want you to have that in your mind, and I want to build this model out a little farther. I want us to move into what's called the simple view of reading. And this is pretty much just what we saw, but a little simpler, where we have decoding, our ability to read the words, times our ability of oral language, our understanding of language. So our vocabulary, words we know, comprehension, auditory comprehension, our ability to understand what we hear. This is oral language. It takes both to be good at reading comprehension. What's the whole goal of reading? Comprehension. The whole goal of reading is not just to be able to read a word accurately. Nor is it just to understand language. If we want reading comprehension, we have to be able to do that all together. So if you have one and not the other, that's why it's multiple. If you have this but not this, you don't have reading comprehension. So let's build this out yet another step farther. If those are separate areas, let's understand that then they can happen on a continuum, where we have kids who have, and so we can look at language comprehension and we can look at word reading skills. And if we look at those, we can put them on a continuum from someone who is good at comprehension and someone who's good at reading. And we start to get this. We start to get someone who's a good reader and good at understanding, and that's quadrant 2. We have people who are good at understanding, we have people good at reading, and then we have people that aren't good at either. But they're separate areas. So I don't want you to think about reading as just someone who's good at the mechanics of reading. You don't have reading comprehension until you have both. So I want us to keep this model in mind as we go. Now there's another aspect here we want to bring in. So yeah, my little smiley faces. We want everyone to be smiling. We want everyone to be in that second quadrant. There are areas that complicate success in these areas as well, that aren't specific about reading, but complicate it. One is a processing speed related to reading that we call rapid symbolic naming. The other is a working memory component that has specifically to do with phonological memory. Remember we talked about phonemic awareness as the first column? Not everyone is equally able to hold sounds in their mind's ear. We need to know these things if we're going to do a quality evaluation. Even if you're not going to do a quality evaluation, you still need to know those things because they will interrupt a person's launch or success in that. So this is the model that we're going to work off today. With me? Okay. Key areas to measure. So if we have a model for reading, what do you think the key areas that we're going to use to measure are going to include? Exactly. That's exactly right. Phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. So, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. In phonics, we need to look at the deeper areas, and we're going to talk about that more in a minute. In phonics, we need to look at, you can see, you have it on your handout, you have it on the screen. These are the areas that need to be included. And phonological memory and rapid symbolic naming. So this should be your blueprint for any measurement that either you are giving or that you are interpreting. So say a person goes out for a psychoeducational evaluation and they come back and you need to understand it, pull this out, fill in the numbers. If you're missing a category, that should be a flag. Not all psychoeducational evaluations or even reading evaluations have these components, but this is what you need to make it informed to understand the student. So I want to talk about phonemic awareness because there's still a lot of confusion here. Let's start with the big header, phonological awareness. Are phonological awareness and phonemic awareness different? This is where I want you all to shake your head. With conviction, yes, they are different. They are very different. Phonological component has to do with the sounds in our language, and it includes three categories. It includes a person's awareness of words in a sentence. Can you count the words in a sentence? The cat went up the tree. The cat went up the tree. Is that highly predictive of a person's ability to read? No. It's phonological awareness, but it's such a shallow measure. Next level down is in phonological awareness is a person's ability to take a word and break it into syllables. Construction, 3 syllables. Is that highly predictive in knowing whether or not a child's going to have intact phonemic awareness to read? No, because that's not phonemic awareness. We have to get down into a person's ability to perceive a sound within a syllable. That's where we get in the neighborhood of understanding whether a child has the necessary pre-phonic ability to learn to read well. So it's that deepest level that's so important, and that gets its own name, and that's what phonemic awareness is. So measures of phonological awareness are not that particularly meaningful for a reader. When you get to that bottom level of phonemic awareness, that's where we need to look. And there's a spectrum there, a continuum from shallow to deep. Rhyming is not that predictive of reading ability. You get into the deeper levels of a deletion test or manipulating sounds, then you get highly predictive correlations to reading. So if a person can say cat, now say cat without k. Yet that is what's called a deletion task. That's what you're doing here. If you have the word up, say up. Now flip them. That's right. That's a manipulation task. If you can manipulate the sounds in a word and you can delete and omit sounds, now you're at a deeper level of phonemic awareness that's starting to become predictive of reading. So what that means is when you get a test and the evaluation has phonological awareness and they passed great, don't stop there. If it's counting words in a sentence, that's not going to help you know about reading. If they're weak in that, that's actually going to tell you a lot, because if they can't count words in a sentence, they're certainly not going to be able to do sounds within a syllable, right? But just because they do well in that doesn't mean that you got an all clear. And just because they can rhyme or blend still doesn't give you an all clear. You got to get down to those deeper levels. Make sense? Okay. Phonics. So we need to look at two components in phonics. We need to look at word recognition and non-word reading. Why? Can someone memorize the words swim, car, fast, down? Absolutely. Non-word reading becomes very important because that will tell you whether or not someone has broken the alphabetic code. If someone can look at a word like D or oot and say that, they might be able to read the word boot, but then you take the B off the front and you give them oot and they're like, well, I don't know how to read that. They haven't broken the alphabetic code. So you need to know what they can do with the alphabet system, whether or not they've ever seen the word. And that's the importance of non-word reading. Make sense? Fluency. So fluency has gotten tangled up. Fluency has come to mean fast reading, because you can time a kid while they read and you get a number, and that number is very concrete and you can measure it, and people start getting very engaged in that number. But that's not really what fluency is. It includes it. Fluency is really about expression. It's about rate, accuracy, and expression. And really the best way that I'm seeing this and become helpful is the practical application. And this was done by Hasbrook. I've seen her present, and she's fantastic. And she's done the quality norm tables for fluency. And she said, fluency is reasonably accurate reading at an appropriate rate with suitable expression that leads to accurate and deep comprehension and motivation to read. That's what fluency is. When you're there, that's the magic. So even if a person has to slow down their reading to get expression and meaning, let them slow down. That's fine. That's the area to practice. They'll get faster. They just need more practice. But don't turn it into the Indy 500. I did a presentation. It's not publicly available, but here's the bit.ly link to it. It's a comprehensive presentation on fluency, and there are two parts to it. There's a strategic part, and there's a tactical part. Strategic part, I'll walk you through what fluency is at sort of a strategic level, and then we go hands-on and start talking about exactly how do you give a fluency measure. How do you score it? How do you interpret it? So it goes nice and deep. And that's at bit.ly/Langsford Fluency, all lowercase. It's on your handout too. Vocabulary, two kinds of vocabulary. Receptive vocabulary, expressive vocabulary. The receptive vocabulary, words you know when you hear them. That's what someone is understanding at a single word level when they're reading. And then expressive vocabulary is what they can generate spontaneously. So there are times where someone may well be understanding, but they can't find the right words to express it. And sometimes it's confusing, is it that you don't understand me or that you don't have the right words? So without knowing both, you don't really have a way to understand what's going on in their language comprehension system. And comprehension. Okay, so there's three types of ways to get language into our brain, right? We can hear it, we can read it with our eyes, and we can read it out loud so people around us can hear it, right? So we've got listening, oral reading, which is loud and silent. Now, what I want to understand is when I'm talking about oral or language processing. I'm not talking about auditory processing, because it's not, processing language is not about the modality through which that language comes. It's once it's in your brain, what are you doing to understand it? Our ability to understand language is based on our ability to dual code that language or imagine it in our mind's eye. So if the language says the cat ran across the yard and up the tree, that will only be processed or understood if you see a cat in your mind running across the yard and up the tree. If you don't have a picture for that in your mind's eye, you're not processing that language. If the cat runs across the yard, goes to the fence, and looks at the horses in the field, that's a picture. But what's wrong with that picture? Right, it wasn't in the story. So now you've added this thing that's going to confuse you, because now you can't do a main idea of the story because you have something in your mind that the author didn't intend. So language processing is not about earphones or preferential seating or something that happens to your ears. It's once it's in your head, once the language has come in through your eyes or your ears or whatever, then it's what are you doing to understand it? That's what we're talking about with language processing. So I don't want us to get busy with reading or how it comes in. I want us to get busy with what are they doing with it once it's in. The challenge is not all comprehension measures are really measuring comprehension. For example, the Wilcox-Johnson 4, the current version, gives you a prompt of a single sentence and then asks you to fill in the blank, like a cow goes. Right. Cow goes moo. Well, is that comprehension? Or is that really vocabulary? I would argue that's a lot more about vocabulary. If you know the word moo, then you fill in the blank. So just because the test says, and I won't jump off the porch. I'm going to stay on the end of the porch. But it goes back to understanding tests, and there's a part that I'm going to get into about, like, make sure you know what the test is actually measuring. So you can't just trust that it says oral comprehension, because what you and I are thinking about in education is comprehension where someone's reading something or hearing something of length, like a paragraph or a story, and do they understand it? Can they answer questions about it? Ideally, can they do a main idea? Can they infer, conclude, predict, right? That's the kind of thing you're thinking. So if you look at a test that says oral comprehension, it would lead a reasonable person to think you're measuring that, and when in fact the test is just a fill in the blank test. So, yeah, know your test. Phonological memory. So guess what? That's intentionally left blank. Phonological memory test gives someone, in most cases, a number or a series of numbers to repeat back. So if I say 2, 3, repeat back those numbers. What if I said 4, 8, 9, 5? That's what it's measuring. That's how the test is done. And that will go up to 9 numbers in a sequence. And it's done forward, right? So I say the numbers and you say them the same way. That's forward. It's not done in reverse. That measures something else. So if you have trouble holding a series of numbers like that, then you're going to have trouble holding a series of sounds, because really those are sounds, right? Okay. And rapid symbolic naming. So there are 2 kinds of symbols that we have that are common: letters and numbers, right? So which set of symbols do you think is going to be most correlative or most predictive of reading? Letters or numbers? Letters. So we really want to do letters. Your test might have letters, numbers, symbols, and colors. That's great, but the one we care about, you don't need to do all 4 of them. Like, do the letters. That's what's predictive. So this is the sample page for the test. What you'll see are 6 letters. They repeat 6 times on the actual page, and you just time the student while they read all the numbers. And I want you to think about it this way. If you line all the 3rd graders up in your school at the end of the football field and you have them run to the other side of the field, are they all going to get there in the same moment? No, of course they're not. you're going to have a continuum. You're going to have some kids who get there really quickly. You're going to have a cohort in the middle, and then you're going to have some kids who trail. What happens if you took those students who were trailing toward the rear every day at recess and they ran? You just gave them practice running. What do you think would happen if you redid the group run test at the end of a couple months? They're going to get slower? They're going to get faster? What's going to happen? Yeah, because they're going to practice more than their peers. They're going to train up that part of their body that wasn't as trained up. The same thing is true with fluency. If you can identify a student who is slow in this area, they may be a good decoder, but they're slow. If you can identify that and weave that extra practice in, they'll catch up. Okay, I'm going to jump off the porch for just 1 minute. So there's a whole field called brain training. The belief or the premise, a hypothesis, that we all wanted to be true is that if you train up an area of the brain, it generalizes to other areas. So in the case of this, we give them letters to read, and they get faster and faster, and lo and behold, guess what happens? You do improve a person's fluency. It just happens. You're practicing that exact area, and the more you practice that area, just like in running, you get faster. But it turns out if you get faster at running, you don't necessarily get faster at doing math minutes, because they're different. So the hope with brain training was you train one area and it generalizes everywhere and everything lifts. But guess what? It doesn't. And they've done massive large-scale studies and studies of all the studies, and they find the same thing. They don't generalize. So if you need someone to be faster in math minutes, you need to practice math. If you want someone to be faster in reading, you need to practice reading. So brain training works on that area you're training, but it doesn't generalize. It's not, unfortunately, the idea that rising tides raise all boats. It turns out it doesn't. The tide only rises for that one boat you're working on. It doesn't raise the whole harbor. So don't run off to try to tackle the big thing. Work on the one you're working on, which is if you're trying to improve reading fluency, work on reading fluency. And don't wait until they're already supposed to be fluent. You can do this test to know. So if there's someone who's slow in kindergarten or first grade, work on fluency then. You don't need to wait till they're disfluent and go, oh, wow, they're really disfluent. Well, of course they are. Do the test, know before you start. Know your tests. So often the question I get is, which test is best? Well, it depends. Depends on the age of the student. It depends what it is you're trying to look for. It depends. Sometimes the best test is the one that the evaluator is most familiar with. Even though it may not be the best test in the field, it's one that you really know up one side and down the other. Depends whether you're trying to document a learning disability or do some to do some testing for an intervention or to do progress monitoring. So there's no right test. What matters is it serving the need you have, and do you have the other tests along with it to get a full picture? I think of a test like a mosaic tile. And when you put the tiles all together, it creates a picture of that student. So that's how you, and the test is an instrument. So it requires knowledge and understanding to use, and that's what an instrument is. So that you think about like a hammer, the kind of hammer you use to pull a nail out of a piece of wood is different than the kind of hammer you use to shape metal. So understanding that a test is an instrument requires knowledge and understanding to use for the purpose you're trying to use it. What do the numbers represent, and what is it really measuring? So, again, what is it measuring? And so this is an example of a reading fluency measure. I jumped off the porch a little bit ago with the comprehension one where we thought it was a comprehension measure. It turns out to really just be a fill in the blank, which feels a lot more like a vocabulary test. Here's an example of a reading fluency test. This is the Woodcock-Johnson again. This test asks a student to read a very short sentence and mark whether it's true or false, and they do this task silently. So they would read, "A fish can swim," and all they're asked to do is to circle true or false. Is that when you have a student read, is that how you would want to know whether they're fluent? No, because fluency in education is something where we're looking at what? Rate, expression, and accuracy, of which this really only is nibbling away at rate. But in fact, they can not read them at all and just circle the letters, and they're going to get a score. So that's back to know your test. This is a reputable test. It's just measuring something different than what you would think it would be when you're looking at a fluency score. So if you get it in a psychoeducational back and it's the Wilcox-Johnson and it says reading fluency, now you'll know this is not the kind of fluency that we would think of fluency in a school setting or a classroom setting. The gold standard of scores really are ones that are found on a normed curve. So these are things that give us standard scores, percentile scores, normal curve equivalents. These are numbers that are looking at that student in relation to other kids his own age or her age. Ideally with a large group of people. So not just like 10 kids, but like, thousands. And they are then, so as opposed to an age equivalent, or grade, for example, what one school does in second grade is going to be different than what another school does in second grade. So it's really hard to use age norms. We really want to use scores that fall on a curve. And so something like this, where you can get from that result a percentile and other scores. Most educators think in terms of percentiles, so that's how we're going to work today. In that is an average range. What is the average range in a percentile? 25th to 75th. So here's the thing. When you're looking at a score from 25th to 75th, if you have a child who's 25th percentile, that means out of 100 kids your child's doing better than 25 of them. That means 75 kids out of 100 are doing better. I think it's hard sometimes to feel really good about your child's progress, yet it's average range. So we need to think about how a child's doing with respect to the population. We also need to think about how a student's doing with respect to him or herself. So if they have IQ scores that are strong, they have good reading scores that are strong, and yet their comprehension scores aren't, that's a gap. So I think we need to look at how do they fall on the curve with respect to themselves. So we can use average as a guide, but we don't want to get too hung up comparing a child to someone else. I think we need to think more about how a child compares to himself or herself. And then we need to understand floors. So I think it's very important that we understand that a test may or may not do a good job of measuring a student who has weak skills. And an adequate floor in a test measures accurately a child who has weak skills, where an inadequate floor will overestimate their progress. Let me be specific. So for example, if there's a student who's having trouble with phonics and letter recognition, would you want to test and how many letters do we have in our alphabet system? We have 26. So would you want to use a test that's going to identify, that only uses 13 letters versus one that uses 51 measures of that? Which is going to give you more resolution and clarity? 51, right. So if you have a child who's having difficulty, the floor sometimes is not large enough to get a good sample. So in the case of 13 letters and of 26, that's not a large sample set. When you start looking at 51 letters, you're probably looking at letters that not only include uppercase and lowercase, but also diphthongs and digraphs. So if you're only asking the letter S, that's not going to be nearly as insightful as giving SH together. Do they recognize that that's the sh sound? So are there enough items to measure what you're looking at well? So that's where you hop off the test. Again, Wilcox-Johnson, I don't mean to be picking on that one. It seems like it's coming up a few times, but just know the test and recognize that maybe a another measure like the Wilcox Reading Mastery might give more resolution for something that you're looking at. And then for pseudo-word decoding, the floor also plays a role. For example, if you are a first grade student second month and you get 2 items correct, the first 2 items correct, you can get an average score, a 98 standard score on that test. The Wilcox-Johnson, the Wilcox-Johnson current one, if you're a first grader in the second month and you identify only the letters and sounds and not read a single word, you can get a standard score of 101. So a reasonable person would look at that score and go, we're good to go. Solid average, no concern. Only to find out later that they actually didn't read a single word. I would think that most first grade teachers would be concerned if that student was not able to read a single word. And this test, the floor is such that it wouldn't have revealed that it was actually a problem. So that's what the floor effect is. I don't want to go any farther into that, but that goes back to the idea of know your test. So just because it says something doesn't mean it's measuring that, and just because the score is good doesn't mean it necessarily is. You have to, ideally the examiner provides this in the report where they start talking about, hey, the score was 101, however, they were unable to read any real words. These were all just single letters. I don't find that very often, but that would be the ideal. But it's where you can start to ask the questions of, okay, I see that, but what do I see authentically? Now we get into the good stuff. Let's do some score interpretation. So remember our model. I don't have a simple copy to hand out. I don't have a copy of this to hand out. So if you do have an iPad or something, have that handy while we're looking at scores on the board. Okay, so let's do this a piece at a time on the first one. Hannah, who's 8 years old, she's in second grade, full scale IQ of 100. Phonemic awareness is 19th percentile. How's she doing there? We good with 19th percentile? Nope, I'm not. Phonics, non-word decoding 7, real word reading 6th percentile, spelling is 8th percentile. We good? No, not good at all. And fluency, which is in this case, this is the GORT, Grail Reading Test, rate, accuracy, and fluency, all 6th percentile. So it all plays out that it can't perceive the sounds in words, therefore isn't able to decode or unlock the alphabetic code, which means when she gets in context, she's struggling. What's vocabulary like? Solid. And comprehension. You can see I've got these switched, by the way. I just noticed that. These should be flopped around. But comprehension. Is she understanding language that she hears? Is she understanding language that she's reading out loud? Correct. Is she understanding language that she's reading silently? No. Why, in comprehension, why is this so much better than here? Why is her listening comprehension so much better than her reading comprehension? Right, she can't read. So, of course, she's not doing well. And let's dig into this one just a little bit. Why is her silent reading comprehension better than her oral reading comprehension? I want to call it an anomaly, but it's just a reality of a silent reading comprehension measure. When a child's reading out loud in an oral reading, you have them read, you have them follow along, and when they're done with the passage, you take it away. They read it once through, then you remove it. When they're reading silently, you leave it out. You can't, and they're reading quietly, they may read it once, twice, 3 times, you don't really know. So they have the ability to read and reread and reread. Follow me? So given that extra effort, now it's exhausting and tiring, but they can a diligent kid can be conscientious and pull that information out on a second or third read. So it's not unusual for us to see a silent comprehension better than an oral reading comprehension. Plus, when you're reading aloud to a stranger and you're not good at reading, sometimes you might not be as comfortable and your comprehension brain might pull back a little bit. Okay, and then the complicating areas. So are we super concerned about phonological memory's 37th percentile? That's above a threshold to where they're fine. That's not what's going to be. That may be contributing to some of this, but that's not a primary concern of ours at this point. And rapid letter naming, no. Although a high score there can kind of bite you in the rump a little bit. So when you actually start having them read, if their engine, their reading speed is tuned pretty fast, what do you think they're going to want to do? Yeah, they're going to want to keep moving. They're going to skip over a word rather than stopping to sound it out. So sometimes you've got to retrain that habit. They're just used to, let me go. It's like the horse who's ready to run. So that's notable, but it's notable in terms of like individualization or a differentiation for that student. Okay, so there we are. There's the hotspot. So what quadrant kid is that? Correct. That's a quadrant 1 kid. Okay. Let's talk about Chris. 12 years old, 6th grade, full scale IQ of 105. How are we doing with the mechanics of reading? Or how's he doing with the mechanics of reading? Yeah, pretty solid. Look at that. Accuracy, 91st percentile. It's supported by a deep understanding of the alphabetic code. And wow, he can work with sounds. So he's nailed down pretty tight there. Now let's look. We got a 105 IQ. Receptive vocabulary, 86th percentile. Expressive vocabulary, 34th. What do we believe then about how well he's understanding the individual words he's reading? Yeah. So we have a student who can read quickly and accurately. He understands the meaning of the individual words. What's happening down here, though, in comprehension? Drops out, doesn't it? Drops out a lot. So what quadrant? Oh, let's go here too. Phonological memory, rapid automatic naming, that all makes sense because he's fast and fluent and all that. So what quadrant is he? Yep. What's gone wrong? Yep. And within that, what do we know about where's his language comprehension dropping out? Why is he having, what is he not doing that he needs to get lifted back up? That's right. It's not visualizing. This is not about pulling that highlighter out. This is not about strategies. This is not about rereading. This is not about getting the book out that says main idea and reading a paragraph and answering questions. This is about processing language. This is cognition. This is about when you read, you have to make pictures in your mind's eye that match the words of the story. If you're adding stuff in, leaving stuff out, then you're not understanding the text. And therefore, when it does come time to do the strategies, so like write an outline or draw a picture, like none of those things make sense because the internal picture is not in place. So they can't do external stuff until they have the internal stuff. This is not about not having heard it right. This is not about sitting in the front of the classroom or the back of the classroom. This is not about having louder information come in. This is about what do I do in my mind to understand the language that I hear. So he's so that's what's going on there. Having fun yet? Okay, so I didn't break this one out into the pieces I intended, or at least my slide animation didn't act up. So guide me through this one. What's going on here? I'll just lay it all out. This is Oscar, full scale IQ of 105. Say it again? Yep, he's struggling for sure. So let's do one chunk at a time. Phonemic awareness is the pre-phonic piece in place. 19th percentile. Nope. Not surprisingly, if the pre-phonics piece isn't in place, how's his sounding out of words, real or non-real, or spelling, right? Not good. And so I didn't say this already, but it should follow that sounding out a word is decoding the word, like lifting the word up to your brain. Spelling it is the same conduit. It's just the reverse. So that's encoding. So you have decoding and encoding. It's the same alphabetic code you're trying to run through. So of course the spelling isn't strong either. And then if you're not perceiving the sounds in words, able to sound out words, then what happens? Yeah, your contextual reading accuracy is not good, therefore you can't be fluent. So that's what's going on there. Is that expected or unexpected? His vocabulary is 88th, full scale IQ 105. Is there anything that stands out that says, God, you're limited? Like, of course this is difficult for you. So we've got basically a full scale IQ of 105 is, I don't know, what's that, one percentile score, what was that, 110 or something like that, in that range? Something in that range, but solid. So is there a gap here? Is there an unexpected gap between decoding and ability? Yeah, there is. Okay, then let's jump into the comprehension and language processing. Got a listening comprehension at 25th, oral reading of 2nd, and silent reading. So we know that if he's not decoding, what would we expect for his oral reading and silent reading? Yeah, so that follows. That would make sense. Is the listening comprehension score expected or not? No, it's really not. And technically it's average, right? 25th percentile. But is it average? It's not average for him, not when you have a receptive vocabulary of 88th percentile and a full scale 105, nor even with a 42nd expressive vocabulary. So yeah, so what quadrant is Oscar in? Yep, he's in quadrant 3. Double frowny faces there. He's got a tough row to hoe. Totally treatable. This is absolutely remediable. But he's not going to get there a day or two a week doing something for 4 to 5 years. And if he does, he will never recover. If he goes through the traditional kind of remediation plan that we've seen with sort of what I call reading remediation generation 1, these are programs that are developed by people in the 1800s, were published in the early 1900s, where you do a day or two a week and you go on a fixed curriculum. You never close the gap. Like if you're not reading and comprehending, what's your vocabulary going to, is your vocabulary going to stay good or is it going to drop back? It's going to drop back. What about your writing? Is your background knowledge going to be the same as everyone else's who is reading? No. That gap, while they're going through remediation, they're getting farther and farther and farther behind. And that child you can't close the gap. The gap's getting wider and wider. So you can't do the old traditional remediation here. This needs a quick lift, but the outcomes are fantastic. He's absolutely capable of doing the work. He just needs systematic, explicit instruction in decoding, woven in with explicit instruction in dual coding, concept formation, and then you weave them together and then they can launch. Okay, Linda. Excuse me. What's going on with Linda? Where are we with the mechanics here? Yeah, not fantastic, right? Where's the source of the problem? Yeah, phonemic awareness. So you can do phonics all day long. You can start up and you can just jump on the phonics wagon and do that. If letters are present, you're doing phonics. So if this child's instruction begins and there's a letter out on the table, you're doing phonics instruction. Phonemic awareness instruction happens in the absence of print. It's working with the sounds that make words, not letters. As soon as the letter comes out, you're doing phonics. And traditionally, we just see kids get a lot of phonics, but it doesn't address it. And then they're super reliant on memory, and they're trying to, it's just a struggle, and they never get fluent. So you got to go back to the phonemic awareness, treat that. Where is this student, Linda, on uh, oral reading and oral language skills? Well, let's look. So decoding's poor, right? So what would we expect with reading comprehension? Right. So oral reading, 2nd percentile, silent reading, 8th percentile. How's Linda doing with listening comprehension? Yep. And vocabulary. And all that's pretty well in line. So what quadrant is she? One, two, three, or four. She is quadrant 1. The challenge is if you look at her scores here, it could bait you to believe that she's not processing language. But she's not processing language because she can't read language to process it. But she's got an all clear here. But here's the rub. What do you see here? What's going on with her phonological memory and rapid symbolic naming? It's low. So this is a person that is what the research community will call a treatment resistor. This is a person that you do the traditional kind of work with them, even Gen 2 work, which we talk about as structured literacy or science of reading work, and they still don't come along all that great. Because there are two key deficits that are getting in the child's way. Deficit 1, a significant weakness in phonemic awareness, and not just a shallow level, a deep level, and a low rapid symbolic naming score. When those two get together, we talk about it as a double deficit. And those kids don't get fluent unless there's a lot of things happening early on to build that fluency. They need to be running every day, as we talked about, and they need really explicit instruction. And then there's a third thing that rolls in that phonological memory. Okay, so when there's a low phonological memory score, they absolutely need one-to-one work. Because they need to hear something in a smaller piece than what's typically delivered. They need to practice that piece to a level of mastery before the next thing is brought in. It's called chunking. Like if you need to learn to drive a stick shift, you cannot have someone give you all the directions at one time. You need to practice one thing. Sit in the car, lock the door, then push the clutch in and out. The clutch is the pedal on the left. Push it in. Good, let it go. Push it in, let it go. That's what the clutch is going to do. Then I want you to take your right hand and I want you to set it on the gear shift. I want you to push the clutch in, and I want you to push your gear shift forward. And then just do that. Like each thing you add, one specific direction, you add it to the next, that becomes chunked into one thing, you add the next, chunk it to the next thing, add the next, chunk it to the next thing. Someone with a low working memory, low processing speed and deletion can have an excellent outcome, but you've got to bring fluency in very early. Every instruction needs to be small and chunked to the next one. And one of the things that we often see is that a school will see this pretty quickly. By the end of 1st or 2nd grade, they'll get a referral to another school. Oftentimes that's a special school, and then they end up in a special school. The challenge with that is that it's still group curriculum. And so then we see that student about 2 years later because they still haven't lifted in the reading area. And then rather than being in 2nd grade, they're in 5th grade, and the gap's gotten too big. This is totally treatable, but it's got to be in a one-to-one setting where there's systematic. I'm not saying it has to be Langsford. I'm just saying it needs to be one-to-one when you see a low memory score. They've got to weave into it fluency work. If you wait to the end and do something that is fluency at the end, that's not so helpful either because you didn't marry it in the teachable moments early on. So you need this sort of customized thing where they're doing deep systematic instruction, phonemic awareness, weaving fluency exercises in it, and doing that whole scaffold questioning piece. And it's just never seen it work in a group setting, even 2-in-1, even two students together, who, even with the same pattern of scores, are stuck in different places. So very treatable, good outcome, very good potential, understands, but the traditional reading work just doesn't lift it. Okay, how do we recognize dyslexia? Who feels pretty solid in this area? Who has some questions in this area? Wow. Okay. Pretty committed. Okay, let's jump in. Dyslexia now affects over 55% of people and is no longer considered a disorder. Is dyslexia a blanket term to just represent a kid who's having trouble in school, or is there a specific definition that we can use to guide us in interpreting whether or not someone has dyslexia? It's a specific definition, and here it is. Dyslexia, this is, and when I say a specific definition, this was put forth by the National Institute of Health and has been adopted by every single leading reading organization in the world. This is also the definition of dyslexia for the state of Kentucky and almost every other state in our nation. So it's this phrase. So here it is. It is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. Why is that important? It means it happens in the brain. It doesn't happen in the ears. It doesn't happen in the eyes. It happens at the level of the neuron in the brain. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition. Translate that. What pillar? Phonics. It's the phonics pillar. And there's now a component of fluent. The original definition didn't include a fluent part. What column is that? That's our fluency column. By poor spelling and decoding abilities, phonics column again, these difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological components of language. What pillar? That's right, phonemic awareness. Unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. That's why we have a vocabulary. If there's an IQ score, not required. A person does not need an IQ test to be diagnosed as dyslexic. Not required. Fine to have, but not required. You do not need that. We can look at a vocabulary score and see that they have good potential. You can look at a listening comprehension score. If they have good oral language skills, that is plenty to know that there's an unexpected gap between their decoding ability and their other abilities, other language abilities. Unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. And then, picture the columns in your mind. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension, reduced reading experience that can impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So which two columns? There you go. Do you see how it all folds back to the core model of rating? So someone who has dyslexia has a breakdown across those columns, particularly the first three, and the core is here. So, is dyslexia a visual problem? No. Do kids with dyslexia see letters and words backwards? No. Can you measure dyslexia, whether a child's writing in mirror images? Is that a signal of dyslexia? No. It is a deficit in the phonological components of language, and so let's look at Hannah. Technically, does she meet the criteria for dyslexia? Does she have a breakdown in phonemic awareness? Phonics? Fluency? Is it impacting oral? Is it impacting her reading comprehension? So does she meet criteria? Yeah. I also gave you pretty extreme versions, right? So where the trick is when they're middle of the bell curve. So I'm giving sort of extremes. What about Chris? Dyslexic or not? No. Is there a break? Because there's not a breakdown of phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency. There is a difficulty going on. It just has to do with language processing or comprehension, but it's not decoding. What about Oscar? Yes. Linda? Yes. And dyslexia likes company. It is not unusual when someone has dyslexia for there to be a co-occurring friend. So it can be weakness in working, the top three, phonological memory, rapid automatic naming or rapid symbolic naming, and ADHD. Those are the typical ones. So let's not lose sight of the whole point of reading. The goal is to be such a good reader that you're not thinking about the reading, you're thinking about what someone's understanding. They're thinking about the pictures that you make in your mind's eye, the joy that comes from it. And reading is literally a cognitive upgrade. You literally are rewiring your brain in a way that nothing else will, that changes so much of the neurology in the brain that it's a lasting impact. That you have the ability to onboard information that was never before possible. You can read about things that bring you thoughts and imagination, take you to places you could never go, and cause you to think about things you could otherwise never think of. Our ability to read is so far efficient over listening, it's not even comparable. The rate at which a skilled reader can read is massively faster than someone can listen to an audiobook, and their understanding is far superior. When we read, we have the ability to stop, gather our thoughts in the middle of a paragraph, jump back, check a word we read. We are able to bring that information in so much more effectively when we read than when we listen. When you listen, you're at the mercy, the decision of the speed, cadence, expression, pauses are all by the narrator. It's not that it can't be enjoyable, and I love audiobooks, but if I need to learn, I'm not listening to audiobooks to learn. It is not a substitute for a person's ability to, we don't want kids to get to high school where they have to listen to their physics book on tape. They cannot get the same level of information out of it, and that's well documented. So what we want is for someone to be lifted to, for them to be a skilled automatic reader where they're thinking about the pictures in their mind's eye. And if we think about the student who starts that early and they're reading just 20 minutes a day early on, if someone starts school reading 20 minutes a day, compared to someone who's reading either not at all or only 4 minutes, by the end of 8th grade, that's the difference between the equivalent of 80 school days versus 16. And there's no comparison then when you look at that student in high school. Their writing ability, vocabulary, background knowledge, ease of understanding, joy of life. I mean, it's just really, it all spans out. So, the golden rule of assessment. The best designed assessment with the most reliable and valid measures administered by the best trained examiner won't change a child's reading trajectory. So, it's what you do with that information that matters most. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time and attention. If you have any questions, I'm happy to stay. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have a kid that you're questioning about. You are welcome to take the file, make a copy, scratch the name out, email it to me, fax it to me, and I'm happy to go. I don't charge. I'm happy to walk through, what's going on with a student. Particularly while you're trying to get up to speed. So we did cover a chunk today. I hope this falls in the model that you're most familiar with, and that everything kind of folds back on itself. And while you're building confidence in interpreting measures, feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to help you. Have a great day. Thank you very much.